With 33 countries and around 670 million people, Latin America is known among linguists and anthropologists alike for its rich history and ethno-linguistic diversity. All across Latin America, there are around 500 indigenous languages spoken, such languages as Nahuatl, Purépecha, Quechua, Quiché, and Pirahã. But now, due to a variety of factors, those numbers are dwindling as language death ravages this region's indigenous communities. According to the World Bank, 1 out of 5 indigenous peoples have lost their language in the past 2 decades, and 26% of indigenous languages in the region are at risk of disappearing. Furthermore, according to the 2001 Bolivian census, a country known for its large indigenous population, 62% of the population identified themselves as indigenous. Alarmingly, though, the same census 11 years later put that percentage at a striking 40.57%. It is also important to mention that the census was purely people self identifying themselves as indigenous, not necessarily just speaking an indigenous language. In order to properly delve into this problem in depth, it's important to first define the term language death. A language is declared dead when its last native speaker dies, because there's nobody left to pass the language on to the next generation. A good example of dead languages are Latin, Hebrew, and Sanskrit. These languages are still used, namely in a liturgical context, but they are not spoken natively by anyone, and haven't been for centuries. A dead language can easily become extinct once it loses its second language speakers. An extinct language is spoken by a nobody, not even in restricted contexts such as liturgically. If extensively documented, dead and extinct languages can make a comeback through revival efforts. Hebrew did this, and is now spoken once again in daily life after centuries of dormancy. So, with that out of the way, what is causing this massive decline of indigenous languages in Latin America? There are a multitude of possible culprits, but the first to be discussed here will be poverty and economic opportunity. Indigenous communities in Latin America are disproportionately more likely to be poverty stricken than typical populations. Around 43% of indigenous people live in poverty in the region, which is exactly double the typical poverty rate. Poverty, of course, already makes it difficult for families to survive day to day, but it also has the additional side effect of driving assimilation. Children who grow up in impoverished indigenous communities will likely receive little to no education, especially in their native tongue, leaving them illiterate. If they have an opportunity to receive an education, it would be elsewhere, where Spanish is more likely to be spoken. At home, when indigenous parents are presented with the choice of teaching their child their native tongue or Spanish as they grow up in their formative years, they will strongly prefer Spanish. Spanish is what's called a prestige language. It's the common language, the language of education, science, business, government, law, and opportunity. The prospects of speaking Spanish are simply much more practical. For impoverished indigenous families looking to survive and provide their children with opportunities in education, the choice is clear. This, of course, causes a lack of intergenerational transmission, leading to language decline and loss. This is a form of passive assimilation. As with each new generation, children will retain less and less of their indigenous identity, culture, and language, instead opting for the majority culture. By the time indigenous children finish elementary school, less than 32% will retain their indigenous language, with that number falling to 5% after high school and only 2% after university. Moving on, another major factor discouraging intergenerational transmission is prejudice, discrimination, and oppression. As most people know, indigenous peoples have endured a lot throughout history, and to get into colonial history merits its own video in its own right, which is why we will merely talk about one specific topic. During Spanish colonialism, Latin America had a ruthless hierarchy, with the indigenous peoples at the bottom and the white Spaniards at the top. Unfortunately, this has had a lasting effect on Latin American culture and society, leaving behind scars that show themselves in the form of colorism, prejudice, and anti indigenous sentiments. This even extends to indigenous peoples themselves, who are often ashamed of and try to hide their indigenous identities because of the stigma surrounding them. This, in turn, discourages parents from speaking their languages or practicing their culture openly, hindering intergenerational transmission. Sometimes, however, politics and violence cause indigenous people to fear for their lives because of their identity. During the Guatemalan Civil War, the Maya people were specifically targeted by the military and systematically executed in a massive genocide. Around 626 villages were razed, and 83% of the 200,000 who were murdered or disappeared during that period of time were unarmed Maya civilians. The devastating and lasting effects of this event on the Maya community cannot be understated, and it is unfortunately just one of many atrocities committed against indigenous peoples in the modern age. So it's no wonder that elders who lived through and were scarred by these atrocities committed against indigenous people often hide or do not publicly show their indigeneity, out of fear of putting a target on their own backs or the backs of their families. Therefore, for many indigenous families, raising their children to fit in with the majority culture is just the safest option. However, it's an incorrect notion to generalize that most indigenous people do not take pride in their identities, as there have been efforts towards the preservation and revitalization of indigenous culture and language in recent years, through the efforts of young indigenous activists and national governments. For example, soon after the events of the Guatemalan genocide, a significant Maya movement began in the country, reaffirming Maya identity and language, and pushing for cultural revitalization and rebuilding. A similar movement has happened in South America with the Confederación de Nacionalidades Indígenas del Ecuador, or the Confederation of Indigenous Nationalities of Ecuador. The group led countrywide protests, blocking streets and marching for constitutional changes in indigenous recognition and law, furthering indigenous representations and rights in the country. Other countries have followed suit, such as Bolivia, Peru, and Mexico, which have large indigenous representation in their governments, official language recognition, schools taught in indigenous languages, and economic policies meant specifically to benefit disenfranchised and marginalized indigenous communities. As good as this is for the Latin American indigenous community, the numbers are still pointing towards an overall decline. The current rate of the efforts to preserve and revitalize these languages is unviable in the long term, meaning even more significant change is necessary to the longevity and survival of indigenous communities, their cultures, and their languages. Not to mention, the stigmatisms surrounding indigeneity are still prevalent, especially in the older generations, and the current generations raising children now. In Peru, 27% of the population 75 and above speaks an indigenous language as their mother tongue, whereas that number falls to only 11% for children aged 0 to 4, which is right in the middle of the critical language learning period in their lives. Furthermore, the socioeconomic factors due to generational poverty are still very prevalent in rural communities, which is a main cause for assimilation and general language decline, as parents encourage their kids to learn the language that provides them with the most opportunities. Even further, the looming threat of globalism is only on the rise. As the world grows ever more interconnected, especially with the increasing placement of importance on social media and the internet, greater emphasis is placed on languages such as Spanish and even English, drawing attention away from indigenous languages. So that they won't be left behind in this ever globalizing world, indigenous kids who receive higher education must adapt, leaving behind their indigenous languages in favor of a more internationally recognized language. If nothing significant is done soon, there will be a complete and massive loss of indigenous language and culture within this century. To discuss solutions, we must first restate the problems. The number of indigenous people who retain their language and use it in daily life is rapidly shrinking, endangering the cultures of over 500 people groups across the region. The elders who preserve the traditions and culture of these communities are slowly and silently disappearing, while the younger generations are being taught to hide or be ashamed of their indigeneity, instead favoring assimilation into the majority culture. Indigenous parents in communities that are disproportionately stricken by poverty due to discrimination and systematic oppression fear for their children's futures and, choosing opportunities and security over preservation, teach their children the prestige language instead, in order to better fit into a society that ignores and marginalizes Indigenous people. Overall, the odds are against the Indigenous of Latin America, and it's no wonder that the numbers reflect such a decline across the board. But that doesn't mean that there aren't solutions. To start, poverty is such a massive driver of assimilation, and wide scale government interventions specifically targeted to help disenfranchised Indigenous communities can go a long way. Focused not only on supporting and bringing these communities up economically, but also through public infrastructure works, returning ancestral land, and preventing the harmful effects of climate change, and providing education taught in the local vernacular for the children. Another aspect needed is social change. With education on Indigenous history and culture comes better understanding among the general populace and Indigenous communities, which will create a more accepting environment free from prejudice and ignorance with each new generation. Self acceptance will come about through this way too, especially with the securing of a language's role in its community through the embracement of media, art, literature, and reinstation of daily use, all in the vernacular language. Documentation and preservation are also extremely important, as it allows for the study and safekeeping of general human knowledge for generations to come, no matter what happens. The current situation is dire and time is running out, but with enough significant change in these directions, the state of indigenous languages in Latin America can yet be salvaged and can even flourish. There is change yet to be had, and hope still on the horizon. And if history has shown anything to be true, it's the persistent perseverance and willpower of the indigenous peoples of Latin America.